Hello, good morning. My name is Andy Pratt. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be speaking to you today, and hopefully what I've got to say will be of interest and contribute to the debates that you're having. Let me first share my screen, and then I can help you navigate through my talk. So my topic is understanding and supporting the creative economy. And my objective here is, as it suggests, both the developing questions about the understanding of the creative economy and also policy development. I guess let me just say at the beginning, I'm using the term creative economy because that is the term that is used by UNESCO at the moment. But for the sake of this argument, it includes all the other terminology such as creative industries, culture and creative industries, content industries, and copyright industries. I know there are differences between those, but for the sake of this argument, I think we're linking them together. And what I want to talk about in the first section is about the role of technological change and economic change, and the role of the creative economy in that. And I'll be making an argument for the particularity of the creative economy, that perhaps we need to attend to it in slightly different ways to other industries. And secondly, I want to stress the challenge of information and data for the study of the creative economy. I think the availability of data is to an extent limited. And even that data that we have really doesn't give us enough detail to provide sufficient analyses of the sector. So I want to talk about the value of both qualitative as well as the quantitative data here, and also the importance of identifying the limitations of our knowledge and potentially what we need to know. That is, identifying what we might refer to as the known unknowns, as well as those areas that we don't understand at all, the unknown unknowns. And I argue that this will help us think about reframing policy development in this field of the creative economy. So let me move on to the first section here. And I just want to refer to some sort of foundational points, I think, in terms of what we've learned about development and how this relates to the creative economy. And so clearly some of the influential writing of Amartya Sen, for example, have highlighted us to the importance of at least two key terms here, that is capabilities and capacities. And capabilities are about if you like, the intrinsic capacity, potential of development of individuals and of populations. But for culture, the implication for this is that actually you need to include all of that population, there to be access to the creative economy and also representation in the creative economy. It's about not just production, but also audience and audience development as well. So there's a wide range of issues that I think when we think about capabilities is everybody being able to develop their capabilities and apply them? Are there access problems as well? And I guess this also links to UNESCO fundamental argument about the, in a sense, the human right of creativity, what we might call the creative rights, a notion that achieves a lot of support. But you can't have these creative rights, the right to be creative, the right to express oneself without access to the means of expression, and with media and many cultural forms and economic forms, there is access barriers, either in terms of training or just in terms of access to the technologies often. Capacities is really how people develop and can develop with one another through institutions. And I guess here often we're thinking about the fitness of institutions to actually support the activities that they are seeking to promote. So there's an implication about an evaluation of how effective institutions are. And in the cultural world, partly because of the rapidity of change in this field, that institutions also have to change to keep up in this way. And of course, it points to an area that I'll say a little bit more about, which is that actually sometimes the institutions are not extensive enough, not supported enough, and actually a area of investment is institution building. So this is another way of unlocking the capabilities of populations. Institutions allow them to work together and communicate their activities. One of the key areas classically that is weak for the creative sector are things such as rights collecting societies, which are developed in civil society and often not well supported economically. And you get a vicious circle of rights societies not operating, artists not getting remuneration, and the whole cycle goes on, and you end up with a lack of respect for intellectual property rights and cultural rights. So there are sets of issues there, but also that we can recognize these broad headline objectives about capabilities and capacities in all fields, but particularly in the cultural field. But I guess in the cultural field, it's as more important than most, the importance of local and specific applications of policies. They need to be responsive to local cultural needs and local cultural variation. And this is where we run into a tension with the best practice or one-size-fits-all solution, which I guess in hard-pressed policy communities, it's easier to pull off an already tried out policy in other areas and say, let's apply that to culture. And what I want to talk about are some of the problems with this sort of approach, both in terms of the particularity of the creative economy and, of course, the local context, which itself is about culture and difference. And therefore, actually, generic policies might undermine the very thing that you're trying to support in this way. So the consequence is that often solutions need to be adapted and take on different forms in places, rather than simply a standard solution. And finally, in terms of this general point about thinking about policy and the way that it gets applied in many places, of course, it's almost exceptional in the world is the formal economy of much of the more developed nations. Informality can occupy as much as 60 or 70% of the economic activity of many nation states in the world. And therefore, we have to be attentive to the tensions and issues associated with the borders of the formal and the informal economy, and also those borders that are between the state and civil society. We shouldn't automatically assume that a particular type of policy or governance activity should take place in one sector or another. Moreover, that we see interesting solutions emerging often from the bottom of those involved in day-to-day activities that are working both with the informal as well as the formal sector and working together with them. And I've referred to this elsewhere as makeshift solutions. So in English, the term makeshift is a temporary, but if you divide it up, it's making solutions, but also shifting the agenda as well, or shifting the focus. And that's what I want to highlight as ways we can think about this sort of policy making and solution making at the ground level. So just need to refer back to some of the overarching debates, I guess, that we're all thinking about at the moment, and is the role of so-called fourth industrial revolution economies, the role of digitization and computing, etc. And whilst these terms certainly are important in highlighting us to real changes that are happening, there is a danger of them in the sense that they tend to focus too much on technology as the key element of change, and they don't pay so much attention also to organization. And I'll point to these issues as ways in which, in particular, the cultural economy, perhaps an outlier, operates in quite different ways in this sense. And furthermore, the notion of the simply one technology and leading to a more efficient or innovative technology misses out on some of the cultural elements of technology, as well as the interdependencies between older technologies and newer technologies. So that might be between, for example, in the cultural sector, between more traditional live performance and also digital communication of activities. The interdependence between the two, the interplay, is really important, but also the interplay between not just the front of house performance, but also all of the technical support that happens behind the scenes, as it were. And this more holistic and what I refer to as the ecosystem of cultural production is an important part here. So, pointing to issues about organization, that these grand narratives of change tend to just assume that there's a technology driving change, but we are seeing increasingly in the cultural sector, but also very significantly in leading technology sectors, that processes around innovation, creativity tend to be recursive, that they go back and reiterate activities, and they're extensive. They're not very narrowly defined, but they tend to spin out in lots of different directions. They tend to be non-linear, so they're not like a production line going from initial idea through testing and manufacture to market, but they tend to be a more circular or even a network-based approach. And often we see that it's the institutions and their capacities that are able to organize this production process in this way, and therefore release, if you like, the inherent capabilities there. So organizational form is important. Organizational form can be important in terms of innovation, and these discussions about open innovation are very much along these lines, about the way in which you might develop these activities. So a second dimension I've pointed to here is about technology and organization, is the technology being based just on one technology. Many of these arguments tend to be teleological, in the sense that there's an inevitability to the next higher technology that is the necessary conclusion of this debate. But as I've suggested, I think more often we see a rather more messy model, and a working with various different forms of intermediary technology. So again, referring back to this makeshift idea, is that people are working through the interlinking between different levels of technology, rather than only focusing on the current cutting edge activities. The other thing that comes with this techno-reductivism and also the organizational elements is that we tend to have characterized both creativity and innovation in terms of singular ideas or innovations rather than networked sets of ideas, which are more of a collective solution to activities. And certainly the growing recognition of the importance of institutions is a reinforcement of this idea of innovation and creativity being more dispersed, but needing to be organized in this way. I talked about the way in which many of these ideas filter out into the rest of the economy and have interaction with the rest of the economy and society. And many of these rather narrow models of technical and economic change miss out elements of the formal and the informal, boundaries between the public and the private, or the commercial and the non-commercial, and indeed between supply and demand. So I'm arguing for our need to recognize this broader picture of the production process, which in particular in relation to the creative economy, I'll argue is relatively more important than perhaps we might have recognized. So using some of those ideas, I want to come back to some of the sort of core starting points to an extent in the when discussing the creative economy, and that is what we mean by the creative economy. And traditional ways have been focused very much on this idea of the artistic genius, in that those activities are the so-called core cultural expressions, and then you have various ripples out that are less creative activities and perhaps more technology and more manufacturing activities. And that's how the idea of the cultural economy has been thought about. A challenge to that has been in the past 10 or 15 years is the reconfiguring that to thinking of it more as a production system. And so this idea that moving from creation through manufacture, reproduction, exchange, and archiving, education, and back to creation again, is part of a cycle of production, and that these different elements of the cycle interact with one another and give rise to the activities. And of course, there are different occupations and different industries associated with each of these functions of cultural production, but it doesn't make one or the other intrinsically more important. So the artist is simply just on their own, unless they have, if they're a theatre performer, for example, the stage, the theatre, the technicians, the lighting engineers, the director, etc. Okay, so it's that idea that really this is a bigger set of organisations, and it's this that constitutes what we refer to as the ecosystem. And this gives us a different conception of what the object of policy is for the creative economy, not just the artist or the star, but actually this broader system. And I just refer to UNESCO's framework for cultural statistics, because this was the first attempt to actually try to incorporate such an idea into a program for data collection as well. And just to give you an idea about what this means, because if we're just talking about data, that can seem a rather abstract and dry idea. If you see at the center of this diagram here, we're talking about the music industry in this example, is that process of creating, making, etc. Yeah, but each of those functions has a whole set of organizational and operational details associated with it. This is what they look like in reality. And these activities, for example, in the making, you might have music companies, and of course all the associated support activities of manufacturing, distribution and branding, etc., commissioning, rights management, etc. All of these things flow out. And I guess the point is that normally, I guess in the past, when we've been talking about music, we might only have counted musicians, whereas the argument here is that there's a whole wide range of activities that actually constitute the ecosystem of music production, and it goes far beyond this. And some of those jobs, of course, might be considered as uncreative, but they are an essential part of the system. So just to give you an idea, that is, of the wider sense in which we're talking about this. And so that brings me to one of the key points here is that I think in the past, policy has focused very much upon a narrower definition of what is cultural or creative, and we've not been looking at this wider ecosystem. And therefore, oftentimes we've been focusing on inputs or outputs rather than processes. And processes, as we'll see, have become really important in understanding the activities in the cultural and creative economy. So I guess the implications here are that national governments need to understand the linkages between culture and creativity and economy and society. So issues of training and education, audiences, access, and even things like the broader social expectations of, for example, whether your child should work in the cultural sector, or whether you think, oh, that's not a good career because they won't make any money out of it, etc. Those sorts of ideas, of course, could be barriers in this area. And certainly the challenge of social expectations about whether people should become creatives is an important part in this whole process. But also the recognition that the cultural ecosystem includes a whole range of areas, and particularly a set of ideas, set of activities that actually are at the forefront of driving consumption, particularly fashion activities. So we're talking about a greater turnover of new ideas that is characteristic of when we think about fashion in many of the cultural sectors. And of course, these drive consumption, and that means that people buy things that generates more income. I guess one of the tensions here is in terms of that often we don't recognize the work that's done in cultural production as real work or real jobs in this way. And there are very few countries that actually consider cultural workers worthy of pensions or having formal access to welfare systems and supporting workers, as we would expect in any other area of economic activity. So there are a number of inequalities globally that we see between this sort of catch-up mode of recognizing the creative economy is, in some senses, a regular industry like any others, but it has some particularities as well. And so it's this systemic view of the creative economy that I think is important to stress. And this is it's indicating that we've moved on in the past 25 years or so from simply supporting the arts or culture to a system that is about lateral and vertical linkages, both local and international, of institutions within a complex ecosystem that is produced, and that even the informal activities may have an input to this system, and the difficulty of managing a system where you have elements that are in the informal sector as well as the formal sector. I'm sure you can appreciate the difficulties here, and also the not-for-profit and the for-profit activities. So this is the coexistence of two different types of value systems within this ecosystem. The value system associated with economic value and the value system associated with cultural value. Rather than saying it's one or the other, actually it's an intersection of the two. And I think this is a big challenge for policymakers and politicians when they're thinking about this field, because it's cutting across the normal categories that we are used to dealing with. However, such a perspective is clearly important, I would argue, in terms of us seeing the whole picture, but it's tremendously difficult if we're thinking about providing evidence to policymakers so that we can argue on the basis of evidence that support for the creative economy, for example, is needed. Certainly a lot of work has been done. The Creative Economy reports by the UNCTAD also the UNESCO Cultural Framework have helped, and the number of nation states now have developed mapping of the creative economy, but as I've already mentioned, sometimes in quite a narrow way. So international development in this way is helping, although it's very difficult to produce international comparisons in this way. In terms of data, there are some real problems that we need to address. And that is that there are the known knowns, the things that we do know something about, and then there are the unknowns. There are the things that we know that we don't know anything about, and there are things that we don't know anything about. Okay, and they're very difficult for prediction and policy making. And what can be said from the available data mapping associated with the existing sources is very narrow. It leaves much that is undescribed or is missing, and evaluation is limited to narrow economic proxies, which of course in the cultural sector in a sense devalues the cultural contribution. And critically, in this period of digitization, we see lots of flows of information and flows of trade, particularly digital goods and services translocally are not recorded in the extant system. So we have a big problem here in terms of the key areas of innovation in this field generally are under-recorded or badly recorded, and therefore we are not working forward with a great understanding. Moreover, there's another dimension of the understanding which is hardly recorded at all, and this is associated with the dimensions of the creative economy which are perhaps exceptional compared to other areas of economic activity. And primarily, there are issues associated with so-called project-based working. So this is rather than working in a firm, people work in a project which may have a limited lifetime, and that limited lifetime might only be 6 months, for example. That the turnover of products is not 2 years, as it might be in car manufacturing, but might be 2 weeks with a product. The turnover times in the fashion industry have gone from seasons, 6 months, to something like 2 to 3 weeks to a month in these days. So turnover time and associated innovation time has also decreased in that way. The scale of firms and projects are small. We're often talking about micro enterprises, so enterprises with 2 or 3 people rather than 250 or 500 as is common. The imbalance of risk and reward, these activities are incredibly risky. It's likely 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 are successful. So therefore, you have to develop new forms of asset management and investment management, portfolio management, in order to balance these activities. Also, the role of intermediaries between the small and the large are critical in terms of mediating new relationships. And innovation creativity isn't an added extra, as it is in some areas of manufacturing, but is the essential to survive in the cultural economy. So the organizational ecosystem that is associated with the creative economy is one that is quite unfamiliar. And I just give this as an example that if we think about a data matrix of the sorts of things of the production chain that I've talked about, creation, production, distribution, exchange, etc., and then think about the sorts of things that we might measure, employment, economic activity, and then various aspects of organization power and firm size and transversal interaction. Basically, we have a little information at the top of the table, but there are huge amounts of the table where we don't have any information, even in the most developed economies of the world. So this is an under-recorded and under-reported area of the economy. And I guess, just to sum up and to bring together some issues at the end, is that learning from what different countries are doing and in trying to modify the problems of data availability and data collection, but also linked to new conceptions of the creative economy. and the push towards the possibility of comparative policy making and measurement. So far, most countries have developed measures that are unique to them alone, and it's very difficult to actually think about comparing and contrasting. We could learn a lot through that, but at the moment, that's very, very difficult. Secondly, areas of the cultural economy, and particularly related to cities, are often associated with competition in terms of place-based marketing. And actually, what we miss out on is the opportunity to reinforce cultural ecosystems that may run across cities and countries. And actually, rather than picking winners, you actually support a system that constantly reproduces new forms of innovation and idea, etc. So what the objective is here is the creation of a cultural system that is intersectional, is not simply an addition of the positives and negatives, but actually is a balance of those activities that respects past and future forms of culture, but also is resilient in this way. And I think what we need to do in this way is to focus on some of the issues about making the creative ecosystem more resilient. And many of those things are associated with not simply focusing on the outputs of the number of things produced, but the way that they're produced, and particularly issues such as employment conditions. Many of the complaints that people have about the cultural sector are both low pay for many, not all, but also the working conditions that are associated with precarious labor, etc. But also the difference between different sectional groups of men and women, of the more abled or less abled, and also in terms of ethnicity, that they don't reflect the overall population. So there are a number of issues here that are about the internal processing that still remain to be challenged. Also is the issue of the payment of artists as well. As a society globally, we've still not really resolved ourselves here that society respects artists, but that's not always respected monetarily as well. So there are a whole set of issues here that bind together in terms of long-term sustainability challenges, in terms of education, and also environmental challenges as well, of the linkages that we might have with the rest of society. So finally, I just want to reiterate the point that culture and creative economy, I think, has been demonstrated that it plays a role in development, but it's not just about a technological, teleological mode of development, but one that is far more widely spread and is more based upon an ecosystem of interrelated activities that are about enabling people to use their skills and creativity in this way. Whilst there's a growing recognition of the creative economy with data needs and data collection, we're still at the beginning of that road. And generally, part of this change is going to be more effective if we're able to take full account of the ecosystem and all of its dimensions, rather than simply focusing on either the products produced, the value of those products, or simply the artists. We need something more about the processes and sustainability of this, and resilience of these systems is associated with the operation of the system, and that's what we need, the governance of this. That's another area that we can flag up for policy concern in the future. That's the end of what I'd like to say. I've given you some more notes in my written version of there. Thank you very much for inviting me, and sorry to take up so much of your time, but obviously this is an important and an area I'm very enthusiastic about. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Goodbye.